I'm really grateful to all our guests on the podium, but to all of you. This is an incredibly important election. This is going to be a very tight election, and I'm sure every one of you in this room feels very passionately about housing, but I think many of us share a slight frustration that it hasn't been as high on the political agenda for this election as each one of us would have wanted it to be. So I think it's brilliant that all the key organisations have got together, they've collaborated, and we've put on this event today. So this event is what's known as a non-selective hustings, and that means there's certain criteria in terms of how we've done this. It's staged by a cross-sector group of organisations working on housing. You can see all their logos there. Also, do tweet about it. The hashtag is housing hustings, and do get involved on Twitter. It's also been streamed as well. So as well as people in the audience, it's going to go out to wider. We've got some journalists in the room as well. So alphabetically by party, we have Luke Hall of the Conservatives. Luke is the Minister for Homelessness, and before the election was called, he was MP for Thornbury and Yate, and he was the MP there since 2015. Sian Berry is the co-leader of the Green Party and a London Assembly member who leads on housing issues for the Green Party. And you'd have seen Sian popping up on quite a lot of the big TV debates over the last few weeks. John Healey is the Shadow Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government for the Labour Party and was the Member of Parliament for Wentworth and Dean until the election was called. And Tom Brake speaks for the Liberal Democrats on housing, and he was the MP for Carshalton and Wallington in London since 1997, obviously until the election was called. And he is the Liberal Democrat spokesman for the Duchy of Lancaster. That sounds like you might have a big house one day, doesn't it? That sounds like a very good... So I'll be running proceedings from up here from my pulpit. I feel either like I'm in a church or I'm like Judge Judy or something like that. It's a bit kind of... And how this is going to work is that we have got a number of questions that have been sourced, and people are in the audience who are going to ask those questions, and then we are going to go around all the sort of panellists and hear from them. One thing that I just want to say at the beginning is that I know everybody will be very excited and feels very, very sort of passionately about it, but we actually have got quite a few questions to get through, and I'm sure you'll agree it's really important to get through the breadth of the questions. We've got questions from social housing right through to kind of regeneration and sort of rural issues as well. So I want to try and get through them as much as possible. So what I would just urge people to do is to not be too noisy during it. I know people can get very enthusiastic, but otherwise we will end up kind of losing time. I'm not going to eject anybody for sort of clapping or anything like that, but it would be good if you could just kind of not spend too much time doing that. We will have the chance for obviously applause at the beginning, and there'll be we're not doing opening statements, we're going to do closing statements at the end. Right, so we're going to crack on with our first question. Very important question, a question close to the heart of everybody in this room, and that is about social housing and its supply. And we have Sarah, who is in the audience with us. Sarah suffers from MS. She's been waiting a long time for a suitable home for herself and her teenage son in Brent. And Sarah would like to ask the first question.
Okay, firstly, thank you for having me here. I was in a hostel for 13 months. The hostel cockroach infested. I was living with drunks, people on drugs, mental health patients. It was awful. I wouldn't wish that for my worst enemy. And my medical condition, I've got MS, as the lady said, just got worse. I kept having relapses after relapses. There was a situation where, well, not a situation, what it was, you couldn't come in after 11 o'clock. I felt like I was on tag, like I'd just come out of prison or something. So my social skills went down. I'm holding down a full-time job, trying to raise my son. Awful. Subsequently, Brent Council took me out of the hostel, put me in a temporary accommodation, which now it's awful, full of disrepair. There's a water leak coming in, so it almost feels as it's raining inside the property. The last one I had was over the weekend. I phoned Nottingham Housing. Oh, Miss Martin, there's nothing we can do. It's happening for the property above. So I'm like, so where is the duty of care? I'm your tenant, not the person above. Nothing's happened. The water leak spread. It's gone to the kitchen, in my son's room, the bathroom, the corridor. Currently, I've got no light in the bathroom because the water came down so badly. When the plumber did come, he had to take it down. So it's awful. But what I really want to know is, what are we planning to do to help people like me? There's 1.5 million people on the waiting list for social housing. What and when is it going to be sorted out?
Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing your story with us. So very powerful first question, 1.5 million people on that waiting list. What are you going to do for them? Luke, I'd like to come to you first.
Well, first of all, Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your story. That was an extremely emotional and difficult story to hear, and I'm extremely sorry to hear about what you've gone through with your son. Certainly regarding your situation, perhaps we should, whatever happens tonight, catch up afterwards to talk about making sure that that situation doesn't continue. One of the things that we are certainly committed to in our manifesto is continuing what we call the Affordable Homes Programme. It's a big £9 billion commitment to build hundreds of thousands of affordable homes in our country, including homes for social rent too. We've already built around 450,000 affordable homes in the last 9 years, but we know there's much more to do to make sure you and your son don't end up in this situation again, or other people in the same situation. We've also done something. We've removed what's called a borrowing cap on the councils, which means they can borrow a lot more money to build more homes, so there are more homes available for people in a situation just like you and your son. I think one of the other things that we are very keen to do next year, if we do get returned with a majority, is also bring forward a national disability strategy to make sure that anybody with difficulties is catered for in all parts of their life, and that should include housing too. So that's certainly something we'll be working very closely with in the housing sector and different groups and charities too, to make sure that we listen to stories like yours and many others around the country. But I'm really grateful for your question. Thank you for bringing it to us today. I very much hope that you and your son fix this problem soon, but let's catch up afterwards too.
Sian.
Thank you so much. I'm a local councillor as well as a London Assembly member, and I've cases like yours to deal with all the time. People who've just slipped through the net and are not getting the help they need. Now, Shelter this week put out their report about the number of children in temporary accommodation who are homeless, and it's 135,000 children across the country. That's higher than it's been in absolutely years. It's gone up 80% since 2011, and that year is significant. If you look through all the statistics on housing, on street homelessness, on people in temporary accommodation, on number of evictions, on problems with arrears, everything has seen a rise since 2010, 2011, 2012. And this is down to the policies that the coalition brought in and which the Conservative-only government made worse. This is a report we did in the London Assembly when I chaired the Housing Committee. It's about the crisis in temporary accommodation in London, and it's all, when you look at the causes of this, it's all to do with the welfare reform system and the complete failure to provide any council homes. Luke just said we had 100,000 affordable homes over 9 years countrywide, and that's affordable homes, not council homes. That's an absolutely pathetic.
Sorry, I said 449,000.
400. That's still an absolutely pathetic record when we have the need in London to have 50,000 new low-cost rented homes per year being built over the next 10 years. That's the level we need, and we're the only party as the Greens putting forward the right level of investment in homes as part of our Green New Deal in this election. If you look at our plans, we've got £100 billion of investment in infrastructure in the country and per year, and £38 billion of that is going into homes. And there's a good reason for that. It's because of the policies of the last 10 years that have created this enormous crisis. And it seems like it's been done almost on purpose so that people like you slip through the net, and it isn't good enough.
OK, thanks for that answer. Sian, John Healy.
Sarah, thank you. The story you've given us tonight could have been the same thing that parents of those 135,000 kids might have said in temporary accommodation at present in this country, facing Christmas in that sort of accommodation, hostel style. And this at a time when we've had last year the second lowest number of new social rented homes built in this country since the Second World War, just over 6,000, when, as you say, more than 1 million are waiting on council waiting lists, and many people are waiting for years on those lists. And I have to say to you, Luke, whatever you're doing isn't working, because fewer than 1,000 of those new social rented homes built last year were part funded by central government. You're simply not doing what's needed. And here's the truth behind that, which perhaps your party finds hard to acknowledge, which is that if we want housing to be more affordable, we have to build more affordable homes. And not the bogus affordable homes that can be on sale for up to £500,000 or 80% of open market rents, but new council and housing association homes. And that's at the heart of the plan that Labour set out for housing to fix the housing crisis. Now, our approach has been quite simple. We've taken the views of experts, a number of the organisations behind this event tonight, who are saying, look, we need to be building each year in this country around 150,000 new council and housing association homes. That's what we've set ourselves to do by year 5 of a Labour government, with the £75 billion from the Social Transformation Fund to ramp up that investment. And in truth, you know, all the parties here, with probably the exception of yours, Luke, have made some commitment to boosting social housing. But actually, it's only a Labour government that will deliver this to levels that we have not seen in this country since the 1960s. That's the scale of the challenge. That's the scale of the programme required. And what I also hope is that we can make this, as it was 50 years ago, not just the programme that builds the homes that this country needs, but it can be the sort of common sense that has a wider political consensus behind it. Because we have to do this with a Labour government, and we have to do it to not just to year 5 of a Labour government, we have to continue to do it each year since, whichever party's in power. And so part of the value of debates like this is that it helps forge that type of better understanding, I hope better policy plans, backed by a broader consensus about what this country really needs for the future.
Tom, just before I bring you in, Luke, I'm just going to allow you to respond, because you've had a bit of criticism. And also, just for the audience and for me as well, could you just clarify what is the difference in your understanding between social housing and affordable housing?
Yes, absolutely. Look, first of all, I just answer on John's point. John talks about an admirable objective to deliver 150,000 new homes a year. But I would say it's always, you know, relatively sensible to check the credibility of the Labour Party who are running the government in Wales, who delivered 57 council houses last year. So I do find it a bit of a jump between delivering those 57 homes and delivering 150,000 homes. That's quite a big gap. So you're quite right to hold me to account, my party to account, for making sure that we are delivering a good standard of affordable homes, that's people, and homes for social rent too, through local authorities, for instance. But I would say that you have to have a credible record to challenge us in the way you've done.
But this is, I have to come back on that. This is entirely beside the point. The problem for the Welsh Government is they've got a Conservative UK government. The plans we've set out in this manifesto involve new planning rules, new investment, a new English sovereign land trust. These are the things that need to be in place, whether it's in England or in Wales, to deliver at the sort of scale that we're talking about. New council housing, new housing association homes. And we can build at that scale, not just for the poorest and most vulnerable. We can build as we did after the Second World War, in the years where we ramped it up before, for people on ordinary incomes as well. And for anyone who says it can't be done, in those years after the Second World War, from a standing start, in 3 years, we were building 160,000 council houses a year. Okay, that's the scale of the challenge we face again. That's the imperative that calls us.
Okay, I want to bring Tom in. Luke, you didn't quite answer the question about affordable and social. Tom, maybe you've got an answer.
Well, perhaps I could just come in more generally first. So Just in case anyone was any doubt, I think the Duchy of Lancaster and the big house, I think that's Prince Charles rather than me, in case anyone thought it was me. And just to pick up on Sian's point, I don't think it's fair to say that the housing problem we have got is one that has emerged in the last 10 years. I was first elected as a councillor in the London Borough of Hackney in 1988, and I used to hold a surgery every week, and I had a queue of people round the door who were coming to see me about housing issues. So we have a long-term housing problem in this country that I don't think you can blame one or another government for. And if you look at the building figures in terms of affordable housing, actually in the last 5 years before the coalition, the Labour government were building roughly, slightly less than the number of homes that were built in the following 5 years. And I think all of us have to accept that that is a leap. So we're going to go from, in those 5-year periods, 50,000 homes a year to what we're proposing, which is 100,000 affordable homes a year. And that is going to be a challenge for all of us. A challenge which certainly in a London context, I would say, is going to be much, much harder by the fact that we have seen a big drop in the number of EU citizens on whom our construction industry relies quite heavily. So it'd be hard to see how we're going to be able to build those homes as we lose that very valuable resource. But there are certain other things that we can do. We would want to see, for instance, that local authorities are able to take complete control of the right to buy, to decide whether they want to have a right to buy policy or not, because there's no point in building large numbers of affordable homes if they subsequently are lost from the housing stock, and I think that is a decision really for local authorities to take. There are other things that perhaps could address the point that Sarah made in her opening remarks, which is about, is there action that we can be taking against landlords in terms of licensing to make sure that landlords are decent landlords and we can take action against them if they're not, and policies such as a right to repair to make sure that no one has to sit and suffer as Sarah does or did. And I mean, and I'm sure other people who've been members of Parliament or councillors will see people in their surgeries on certainly on a weekly basis who are raising concerns about a lack of responsiveness in terms of repairs. And I do feel that we've perhaps gone from a position where on that front local authorities were deemed to be incompetent. They handled too big a housing stock. That's now gone over to housing associations in many cases, and I'm afraid that perhaps we've gone too far there in terms of the size of the housing stock that housing associations have and the fact that they're often spread across the country, and we may have lost that local focus, which I think is the best way of delivering good housing for people.
Okay, I think Sian just wanted to come back very quickly, and then I'll let John come back. But
yeah, so I mean, it is, and we have a long-standing problem with housing. If you look at, for example, the loss of council homes due to right to buy, due to sell-offs, you cannot actually make out the last Labour government because they didn't change any of those policies either. But I have to lay the door at the coalition and the fully Conservative government we've had since 2015, because they have had an ideological opposition to funding social housing. In London, we've had the grants devolved to us for some time, but there's still a ton of conditions put on those. We basically had to beg the government to allow us to fund council homes the last time we had a round of grants in London, and that isn't good enough. But also the welfare changes that were made, things like the benefit cap that was introduced in 2012, and you can see, I've got a visual aid, you can see in the statistics that this is 2012. There's been a significant
Sian,
increase in home people in temporary accommodation
come on
since then.
And discuss the welfare stuff in a separate kind of thing. John, do you want to respond very briefly? I'm just conscious of time because we're going to get on to our next question, but if you could just
very
respond
briefly, if I may, because really there is no solution and no plan to fix the housing crisis that doesn't have at its heart a big council and housing association house building programme. Yes, private renters are important, we might come on to that, so is the benefit system, but at its heart, you can't help people who haven't got homes unless you have affordable homes that are secure and available for them. Just on Tom Brake's point, it is certainly the case that the missing piece in Britain for 50 years has been councils building. And we've got to overcome that long-term shortcoming as we plan, as well as the deep failings that we've seen over the last 10 years. But Tom, just to say this to you, and I do know this because I was Labour's last housing minister in that final year before we lost the election in 2010. In that year, we built, not just started, we built nearly 40,000 new social rented homes. Now, if after 2010, and you were a part of the government, there hadn't been a huge cut in that investment, and you'd have simply kept up that level of new social rented house building, we'd have 180,000 extra social rented homes in this country today, more than enough for every family in temporary accommodation, every individual in every homeless hostel across the country, and everyone sleeping rough on our streets tonight.
Okay, thank you, John. Someone on Twitter just did chip in and say, look, this discussion has had there's a lot of statistics flying around, but what they want is an assurance that actually more affordable houses are going to be built. And I might come back to you at the end of the session, because I think it's really important to hear from all of you what you actually think affordable housing means and what's the difference between affordable housing and social housing as well. But we're going to wrap that up now. But could we have a big round of applause for Sarah, who asked the question? Thank you, Sarah. Right. Okay. Moving on to our second question, very, very important topic about building safety. And this question is going to be asked by Jane, who is an architect and former president of the Royal Institute of British Architects and chair of the REBA Expert Advisory Board. Jane.
Good evening panel, and welcome everybody, as I'm the token RIBA ex-president. Welcome to the RIBA. The disaster at Grenfell Tower, and actually numerous subsequent fires in Hackney, Sutton, Bolton, Barking, and yesterday Brentford, have shown that our building safety regulations are still not fit for purpose. The RIBA and many others have argued that we urgently need strong, clear and prescriptive baseline regulations to clarify fire safety requirements and ensure that buildings are safe by design, and that this means that we ensure that there are sprinklers, fire alarms and alternative means of escape provided. Many thousands of people are still living in buildings which we and they know are not safe, and this may just be the tip of the iceberg. What will the parties do to make sure that buildings with known safety issues are made safe, and to ensure that the many new homes we need to build are well designed, well constructed and properly maintained, so that their residents know that they can sleep safely in their beds?
Excellent. Thank you very much for that question. I'm going to ask the panel members to sort of keep your answers a wee bit briefer, if that's all right, because we have got a lot to get through. Tom, I'm going to come to you first on that.
Well, I suppose that the first thing to say, it's important that we perhaps consider investment in public housing as a matter of pride. I think often it is almost an afterthought. I had the good fortune of visiting a school in my constituency earlier today, which is the first secondary school built in the country to passive house standards. And I think that's a good example of public investment. And I think we need to think in that way in terms of the investment we're making in public housing. In terms of concrete proposals to address the safety issues that you've highlighted, well, there are still outstanding recommendations from the Lakanal House fire that have to be implemented, and particularly around the issue of sprinklers. There are concerns, I think, almost perhaps greater concerns around what's happening in the private sector in terms of private owners of blocks and whether they are responding. I think there's a certain amount of pressure that can be brought to bear on the public sector and social housing, but perhaps less so in terms of private sector properties. And certainly I, and I suspect others, have sat down and had conversations with their fire or their borough commander recently to ask them what are they doing in terms of going out and checking that everyone is responding to this. There's a need, I think, for fire drills in buildings that are above a certain height. There's need for annual checks, again, in blocks above a certain height. One thing that we've been pushing, again, or cross-party initiative in Parliament, to try to ensure that there are proper electrical safety tests taking place in both private rented and social housing as well, because we rightly put a lot of emphasis on making sure that gas is properly checked, but we should do the same in terms of electrical systems as well to make sure that those are safe and secure. So, and finally, I suppose, and this is particularly, I think, relevant to where new systems like cladding have been installed, I'd like to see local authorities have much more power to go in and assess those as those works are happening, because obviously the original structure of the building, which may well have been properly tested, is now being modified as a result of some retrofitting, and we need to have the same degree of certainty about that being safe and secure that would have been the case for the original construction.
Okay, Sian.
Yes, so as you mentioned, the Lakanal House fire in 2009 in London resulted in recommendations that basically just sat on the shelf as regards things like the building regulations and sprinklers. And when Grenfell happened, because I know my colleague Jenny Jones on the London Assembly had worked on that report that we did in the London Assembly when that first happened, was immediately just saying, nothing like this should have happened already. And yet we still haven't actually fixed this within Parliament now, because we're delayed again. We're all electioneering instead of legislating. So it does need to be done immediately. It's part of our plan in the Greens to get and legislate for this straight away. And it needs clearing up. I mean, again, as a local councillor, I've got people in my ward, there's works going on. People want to remove some fire escapes that they have, and there's immense confusion about whether or not they should be allowed a second means of escape through this fire escape compared with the stairs, because on a new building of that height, they would have to have. But on an older building, they don't have to have. And it's just, there's no clarity, and the regulations absolutely need clearing up. But the other thing is the state of the buildings that we already have built. And I've been talking to the housing associations about this, and they have an enormous backlog of work that needs to be done on their homes, and that's before they can even start retrofitting for energy efficiency, which is another huge thing. So there's just this enormous gap of sorting out the safety and the energy efficiency of our homes that only a massive, massive investment will bring about. Now, I think we need to get some of the money from the contractors and the big developers who are responsible for these defective homes, but also I think the government needs to step in and just make sure it happens.
Okay, thank you very much. Luke.
Thank you. I mean, first of all, of course, what happened at Grenfell has shone a spotlight on this problem in a way that we haven't seen for many years in this country. And I'll just pick up and agree with the last point about making sure that building owners are acting responsibly for the remediation of their buildings. That's one of the things that we will legislate for if we have a Conservative majority government. One of the other things that we will certainly be doing is bringing forward a social housing white paper, and that will really examine all of these issues that some of them picked up in the opening remarks, but about the safety and security and dignity that people have in the homes that we are providing, and also making sure that people have a means to be listened to when they do raise concerns about the quality of housing. The third thing I think that's really important is that we are completely committed, I think probably most parties on this panel are, to legislating for the recommendations of the Hackett's review of building regulations, and also the first phase of that independent inquiry into Grenfell. So you know, that three-pronged approach of having this social housing white paper to look at all of these issues, making sure that we're legislating to make sure that building owners are taking responsibility, and also implementing all of those Hackett review and independent inquiry recommendations are absolutely vital for us and things we're committed to in our manifesto.
All right, thank you, Luke. And John.
I was down at Grenfell the morning after the fire with some of the residents and survivors and the firefighters that were still on site, and still in some of the flats fires were breaking out again. And I was also in the House of Commons days later when I heard Theresa May say, after that Grenfell fire, we will do whatever we need to keep our people safe. And I really never believed that 2.5 years after that we'd be here still with 267 other tower blocks with the same Grenfell-style cladding that still have it on its side, and 67 of those block owners still have no plan to take it down and replace it. That's the tip of the iceberg, as Jane and Reba will tell you, because there are also thousands of other residents who are in blocks with non-Grenfell-style cladding, which may not be safe, but they're not certain because the government hasn't done and published the results of the testing of other materials. So what's needed is this. First of all, £1 billion fire safety fund to fund the retrofitting, which should have happened after the coroner's report in 2013 following the Lacanal house fire, retrofitting of sprinklers in high-rise council and housing association blocks, and to deal with some of the cladding problems. Second, an open, full testing programme with results published of all the materials that may be suspect on high-rise blocks. Third, emergency legislation, not just to exhort the private block owners in particular, they've got a moral responsibility to deal with these things, but actually to require them to do it, not to charge leaseholders, and to give councils some of the powers they need, either to be able to sanction those private block owners that won't do the job, or take them over to make them safe. And then finally, I don't know about the other panel, I may be the only one here who sat down with the survivors of the Bolton fire just weeks ago. And what they said to me was that they were in a block which hadn't just got the HPL flammable cladding on the side, but the whole system was faulty. They had 3 false fire alarms during that day that the fire broke out. So what's required was set out by Hackett in a report full 18 months ago here, but we still not had the legislation for an overhaul of the whole fire safety inspection and safety system. Now, again, beggars belief, we're still waiting for that. That must happen. And Grenfell tells us our system is shot through and requires replacing.
Thank you for that. Now, we've just had a very interesting question on Twitter. I think, John, you have answered that question. You've said you're going to commit £1 billion for this fire safety fund, but our person wants to know, will all the parties commit additional funding for these plans? Quick yes or no. Tom, yes or no?
Well, we will implement the Lacanal House recommendations.
Okay. Sian?
Yes, we must. As I started to say towards the end there, we do need to try and recover as much as we can from the developers who make huge profits.
That's a yes. I'm being very strict here on timing.
We'll
yes, okay, well done, excellent. Luke, yes or no?
Already provided a £600 million pot to support the quick...
is that a yes or a no?
We're going to implement all the recommendations of both the Hackett Review and the independent inquiry in Grenfell. If that costs more money, then of course that will be provided. Okay, and John, you've mentioned your £1 billion fund, so thank you very much. Great, thank you very much. A round of applause, please, for Jane. That's a really important question. Thank you. We're now going to go to a very emotional topic, something that's very close to all of us, something we see increasingly on a day-to-day basis, something which we shouldn't be seeing, and this is rough sleeping. Kevin runs an inclusive community centre working with people experiencing homelessness, and he himself spent 10 years sleeping rough. And Kevin, you have the floor.
Hello everyone, my name is Kevin Farrell, and my question is about rough sleeping. This matters to me because I lived it. I know how tough it is to sleep out on them streets in central London. It wasn't until I got access to social housing and support services that I got my life back on track. That was more than 10 years ago. Them services, I worry, they're not there anymore. I can say that because I work at the front line now and see the homelessness problem going on. Some research from St Mungos has found that £1 billion £1 billion has been cut from local authority homelessness services over the past 10 years. While homelessness has skyrocketed, 2 people a day are recorded dying while sleeping rough or in emergency accommodation. Enough is enough. What are your concrete plans to end rough sleeping? And will you commit to reinvesting £1 billion a year in homelessness services so councils can deliver the support people need to find and keep a home?
Thank you very much for that. Kevin, if I could come to you first, Sian.
Yes, so we do need to refund councils. Our plans are to give £10 billion back to councils to refund all the service cuts that they've had to make to all kinds of things like this. What we find is whenever we look at a council service, there's about 40 or 50% that's been cut out of it, whether that's youth services or homelessness services, and that absolutely needs to be done. But more importantly, what we do in our plans is we'd create a guarantee against poverty with a universal basic income. Because we talk about homelessness a lot, and it's horrific that people are on the streets, and too many people bring me solutions that are basically putting people off the streets into little boxes to keep them off the streets, and that is not the holistic thing that we need to do. Homeless people are not the weather. They don't need sweeping up like broken leaves. We need to fix the tree and stop people falling off it in the first place. And that is the guaranteed basic income that we want to put together. It replaces all benefits apart from housing benefit and carers allowance, and housing benefit goes on top of that, and it guarantees against poverty, and it guarantees against child poverty, and it particularly guarantees against people who end up on the streets because they're not able to get support from councils and from homelessness services. And it absolutely has to be done. There's no reason for any poverty or any street homelessness in this country, and it isn't that hard to fix.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. I'm going to ask all the panellists to really try and be a bit more brief in your answer. We've still got quite a few questions to get. I know everyone's very passionate, got a lot to sort of say, but a wee bit of brevity. Tom Brake.
Well, we would fund a 5-year programme to get rid of homelessness. Now, I don't know whether that would amount to the £1 billion that you've asked for, but we think that is a deliverable programme. And as part of that, for instance, we would scrap the Vagrancy Act, something that a colleague of mine, Layla Moran, has been working on with a private members bill, something that criminalises people who are simply for being homeless, and there are still too many arrests taking place under that act. We would want to introduce a legal duty for local authorities to call days somewhere safe to stay, so that local authorities were required to assess people so that no one was left sleeping out overnight, and to try to stop perhaps people getting into homelessness, things like ensuring that people had access to longer tenancies, ensuring that, and we may come on to this in the welfare discussion, for instance, making sure that local housing allowance is something that actually enables people to rent somewhere, a big challenge certainly in London, where often that is not, doesn't give people enough financial support to actually be able to identify somewhere to rent locally. So we think we've got a package that is funded. And I think that's perhaps the last point I'd finish on. It's important, you have parties here who are all offering you something, and sometimes I think you're being offered something for nothing, and I think people need to look at what have the assessments of the different parties' manifestos been in terms of whether they are financially deliverable or not.
Okay, John, briefly please.
Kevin, you're right. The services that you relied on 10 years ago to get your life back together and get off the streets are simply not there. You're right that about £1 billion has been cut from frontline homelessness services, and that there are now nearly 9,000 fewer hostel places than there were 10 years ago. The tragedy of this is that we know what needs to be done because we did it before. We did it before as a Labour government in the early 2000s when we were similarly faced with rising homelessness and rough sleeping homelessness. So the plan has to be invest in new social housing, because you can't help the homeless if you haven't got the homes. Restore some of the funding that's been cut from frontline homelessness services. Make sure housing benefit can cover the costs of renting. And in particular, we can save lives this winter with our proposal for a special programme to provide emergency shelter and support in all areas. Because as you say, in this country as decent and well off as ours, it shames us all that we have an average of 2 people a week who are homeless dying.
Thank you, John. Luke, to you now. I mean, obviously, the figures of rough sleeping since 2010 are pretty extraordinary, up 165%. Obviously, we've had a Conservative government in coalition for some of that time, but then as a sort of direct Conservative rule, what do you say to that, and what's your kind of offering to people?
Well, firstly, Kevin, thank you for sharing your story with us this evening. It's difficult to hear what you have been through. You asked about what our plans are for the future. First of all, we're investing still a large sum of money, £1.2 billion in tackling homelessness, and £422 million next year that's already been committed to by the Conservative Party, and £100 million of that is on our rough sleeping strategy, and that's really looking at what more we can do to target people in specifically areas just like where you have been had difficulty in city areas, and that's already starting to work. So we've seen a 32% reduction in the last year where we've been running that programme, or 19% direct reduction. We've also passed the Homelessness Reduction Act, which is quite an ambitious piece of legislation to support people at risk of becoming homeless. And one of the things that we will certainly be doing with the majority government is reviewing that to make sure that it's working well and that we're intervening at the right points. And look, we have brought, and in our manifesto, we've just announced we have brought forward our commitment to ending rough sleeping altogether to 2024 from 2027. So we bring it forward 3 years because of how important this is to us. We know there is a huge amount more to do. I'm sure I could learn a lot from listening to you later on as well. But that's a huge important commitment to us, which is why we have brought it forward, and we'll strain every sinew to deliver it.
But you can't just change the date on which you're planning to end rough sleeping homelessness if you don't change your policies. And you're offering absolutely nothing new that's going to deal with the insecurity for private renters,
That's not true.
the level of new social rented homes, or the frontline services in the hostel places. This is, if you want to deal with homelessness, you have to deal with the root causes. And the reasons it's risen so rapidly over the last 10 years is many of those root causes are directly a result of decisions that ministers have taken over those 10 years.
I'm just going to have to do because. So I'm just conscious we've got a lot of questions to get through, and we have got people that have come especially to ask the questions. So we will wrap that up, but we're going to go to another question now, which actually picks up on some of the themes that we have talked about before, particularly some of the issues that you've raised, Shan, and this is about local housing allowance and welfare. And I believe we have Stacey, who is in the audience and who's going to ask a question.
Hi, my name is Stacey Wayrenby. I'm a former Centrepoint resident. I'm also currently an employee at Centrepoint and a member of Homeless Link's expert advisory panel. So my question is on the local housing allowance. As a young person, I found myself up against the odds when it came to finding somewhere to call home. Private renting was completely out of the reach, as the local housing allowance was nowhere near enough to cover the cost of rent. What made it particularly difficult was the differential treatment and difference in entitlement because of my age. Young people receive the lowest rate of LHA, and that doesn't even change if they're homeless. Now, I was lucky enough to get my social housing, but that was due to cuts that decommissioned the shared housing that I was living in my area. And up until the 30 days before we were being evicted, there was just nowhere to put us. So I was able to get my social housing through a fluke. Had it not been for those cuts, there would be no way that I'd be able to afford a house in the private rented sector. So my question is, will you give homeless young people a fair chance to move on by raising their rate?
Okay, Tom, I'm going to come to you first on this.
Well, I sort of partially answered this earlier. Before coming out this afternoon, I went on Zoopla to look at what was the lowest price that you could find a one-bedroom flat in Wallington, and then looked at what the local housing allowance was, and it's below what the lowest property for rent in Wallington was available for. So we're in a position where, unfortunately, people would have to move further out of London because LHA doesn't pay for a property, and so what we've seen is that the value of LHA has fallen behind as a result of being pegged to inflation, and certainly we would address that, and I think that would make more properties available. But I think to some extent, we go back to the original question we had at the beginning, which is about the supply of affordable housing. Until we're offering 100,000 extra in England, other parties are offering other numbers. Until we have that extra supply of property, I think we will always find that rental properties, the price of renting is going to stay very high because there's a shortage of homes to buy and there's a shortage of homes to rent. So we can do something with LHA, which we're committed to doing, and we should also do something about the supply of housing more generally, because that's the way of solving this problem.
Lovely. Luke.
Yes, Stacey, the LHA rates will be unfrozen under a Conservative government in April. But I think Tom is also right. This is also still a matter of housing supply. So that's why I talked earlier a bit about the Affordable Homes Programme, which is £9 billion that are being put into making sure that we have enough housing being built in this country. We will be building hundreds of thousands of affordable homes, including those homes for social rent. And we'll also still make sure that local authorities have those discretionary housing payment pots to make sure that people who do fall into these situations are supported. But we're absolutely committed to ending that freeze in April.
Okay, and John.
I'd say to Tom Brake, it should be no surprise that you've got those figures when you check out Zoopla. They're a direct result of the fact there were 13 separate cuts in housing benefit after 2010, most of them when you were in government. And the cuts that I think have had the most pernicious effect are exactly on local housing allowance. And unless you've been dependent on local housing allowance because you're in work or you're out of work or you work in the sector, this has gone largely unnoticed. But the fact that it's been cut, first of all, so instead of covering half the properties in the area, it went down to a 30th and then to 10%. Then it was delinked to the rise in rents. So what's the point of housing benefit if it's not linked to housing costs and then frozen for 4 years? Now, the answer to this has got to be, number one, restore the link. Number two, raise it a level again. So the short answer to your question is, if we get a Labour government, we'll do both. And the answer to your question is yes.
And,
can I just come back on
well,
John?
hang on, Tom.
Because if we're going to trade blows...
Tom, hang on a minute. I want Shan to come in and then you can come back. All right, Shan?
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, so as I was saying before, the first set of benefit changes that were brought in, which is the freezing of the LHA and the introduction of the benefit cap, which is the overall benefit cap, which again has an effect on this, was 2012 under the coalition, and then in 2016 both of those things were worsened again. The LHA was frozen for 4 years and the benefit cap was lowered by the Conservative-only government. So both parties either side of me have some culpability in this. And the introduction of the age discrimination is appalling. Obviously some of the answers that John has said are completely correct. We need to restore the link and increase the amounts. But one of the things that I wanted to point out was that I've looked in the Assembly at hidden homelessness. So before we're talking about 135,000 families that are in temporary accommodation. Now they're the ones we know about. I've looked at hidden homelessness in the London Assembly, and there we have whole families sharing with other families who are putting them up. We've got many, many young people who are sofa surfing because they just cannot get anything with the benefits they're entitled to. I did a survey and I found that 1 in 4 Londoners has put up somebody who would otherwise be homeless, that 3% of Londoners are doing that right now, and that's 100,000 people who are bearing the brunt of the housing crisis, looking after their fellow people and making up for these enormous gaps in the welfare system. If it wasn't for them, we'd see many, many more people on the streets, and a lot of them would be young people like you, because I think the system's deliberately shut you out.
Okay, Tom.
If I'm going to trade blows with John, I could rather cruelly point out that homelessness in England peaked in 2003, which was actually under a Labour government. But I don't think people want to hear us trading blows. There's the graph if people want to see it.
But no one wants to hear that, do they?
I think what people want to hear is what actually the parties are proposing in their manifestos.
Exactly.
And that's why I'm very proud that the Resolution Foundation, which has looked at the party manifestos, has suggested that the Liberal Democrat manifesto is the most progressive in terms of dealing with the welfare issues that many people in the housing sector will be addressing on a daily basis.
But it's not trading blows, is it? It's trading facts. And
well, there's your fact on
homelessness. John, we're not all... John.
By the end of 2010,
I know this is annoying having a chair, but like sadly it's just a... But actually before any of you come back, I actually want to come to Luke on something, because someone has sort of tweeted in saying, look, the Conservatives haven't really mentioned local housing allowance or housing benefit in their sort of manifesto. So, the moment the polls, everything's still to play for, but it looks like the Conservatives are, leading on the polls. What do you say? Because obviously housing benefit is a huge part of this story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it might be worth checking again, because we have committed to unfreezing that in April.
but have you committed to closing the gap between what the rental sector is going to charge and what the housing benefit will be? Because that gap is the problem for a lot of people.
At the moment, the commitment is that we'll end that freeze in April this year. All of the, but it's also worth saying that over half of the money that was saved from that freeze has gone back into supporting the most vulnerable people in those situations. And on top of that, we've had that £1 billion of discretionary housing payments that's available to local authorities to support people in those vulnerable situations. Okay. But we've made our intentions very clear.
Okay, Sian, you wanted to come back on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up the Resolution Foundation statistics, because they've looked very closely at the policies of the other parties, and they found that the Conservatives' policies in their manifesto would increase child poverty, which is particularly what they were looking at, that the Labour and Liberal Democrat investments of an additional around about 9 billion a year would reduce the rise in child poverty, but not make it significantly better. And I'll point out once more that our policies are to eliminate poverty, and that is something that is really something we can do. It's a big investment, it's another 80 billion nearly, but it's money that we can find through changes to taxes, changes to corporation taxes, and the carbon taxes that we're putting forward. And this is the kind of investment that we need in our country, not bits and pieces and making up a little bit for the losses that we've seen under the Conservatives, but actually eliminating poverty. It's really important. I just want to make that point again.
Okay, well, very well made. Thank you very much. And please, we have a round of applause. Thank you so much for coming here today and for sharing your story with us. Okay, right, we have talked a lot about the urban housing crisis. Let's talk about the rural housing crisis right now, because that's another very, very important question. The next person to have the floor is Will. Will represents an organisation called Exmoor Young Voices that aims to listen to the voices of young people living around Exmoor and bring the change necessary so they can continue to live and work in the area. Will, you have the floor.
Firstly, thank you for inviting us here this evening. I'm Will, I'm from Exmoor Young Voices. A little bit about myself, I'm from a tiny village on Exmoor, where I'm the youngest person by a generation at the age of 29. I still live at home with my parents, and we're also caring for my grandparents there too, and there's no prospect of me moving out. Our group believe that we should have the right to secure a house and that we can afford to live in, whether that's social or building the house itself. Within rural areas like Exmoor, house prices are often too far out of reach for people who live and work here. The ability to build is tough. The National Park, with their stringent 106 agreements attached to new builds, added to the near impossibility of getting a mortgage for both 106 and self-build together, makes self-building a near impossibility. The waiting lists for social housing are enormous, forcing out younger people and their families, and leading to community services like pubs and schools to shut down. Of the 5,000 houses on Exmoor, 1,000 are empty. 579 families are waiting for a social home, but no new ones were built last year. On Exmoor, it's believed we have the biggest gap between wages and house prices in the whole country, and last year West Somerset came last on a social mobility study, yet nothing's been done to address this. As you can see, there are many problems in trying to get a home in rural areas such as Exmoor. Will your parties listen to groups such as CPRE and Exmoor Young Voices and ensure that rural areas get their share of funding and investment to readdress the balance and try and create truly affordable homes?
Thank you very much for that question. Will, John, I'm going to come to you first on this.
Yeah, I'd just say to you, Will, it's good to hear from Exmoor Young Voices, but CPRE makes sure that people like us hear that case. And I think your point underlines the fact that the housing crisis is a crisis across the country. In rural areas where we build fewer homes, it's even more important that what we build is affordable to local people on ordinary incomes. The situation has got worse. You can't step back, as the government's done, and let developers build in these areas with no affordable homes, and that's the system we've got at the moment. So number one, a Labour government would change the rules so we have a presumption to ensure that any development on any size of site, especially in rural areas, includes affordable housing at the heart of that. Secondly, we'd end the so-called permitted development loophole that allows some developers to build and convert homes without even going through the planning process. And third, we'd introduce a new national levy on second homes used as holiday homes. So in areas like Devon or Cornwall or Cumbria or Norfolk, this would start to introduce a price premium on those sort of homes, and the money we'd raise, we'd say we'd devote to boosting our efforts, to link to a previous question, in dealing with the homelessness crisis that we've had. So
Great.
people who've done well out the housing market pay a bit more to help those with no home at all.
And it's also worth pointing out that, of course, when even just a few people kind of leave an area, that has an effect on public services as well. That critical mass is very, very important. Tom?
Our housing spokesman is Tim Farron, who, representing part of Cumbria, understands this and is in a place where lots of homes are second homes. And so we would want local authorities to be able to charge up to 500% council tax on those empty homes to encourage people not to leave them empty. There may be some changes to the planning rules that they'd be quite difficult, but we would look at about trying to make it a planning requirement to change. If you were the owner of a home and you were going to sell it to someone as a second home, there'd be planning, in effect, a change of use to try and control that process. There are some schemes that we have sort of supported around allowing farms to be converted into barns, for instance, into a mixture of social affordable housing and perhaps housing for the use of the farmer or their son or daughter, for instance. And I mean, I think we need to see this a bit wider because, of course, it is fantastic providing the affordable homes in a rural area, but if there's no transport access to them, then that person still ends up being isolated. And that's why we have talked about investing something short of £5 billion into bus services to try to bring back some of those services so that if you're building the homes, the people who are living there, often on low incomes, £20,000, less perhaps, who are going to need a car to get anywhere, and if that transport system isn't there, they're not actually going to be able to really take full advantage of the home they're living in.
Right, thank you very much. Sian?
So for this problem, there's a whole other sort of chunk of green policy and green values that comes in, which is community-led development, community-led homes, community land rights. And the place to look, and I've been around Cumbria and I've been around the West Country as well, and we've got this huge problem of empty homes, empty other buildings, some abandoned, the holiday homes, all of those things. One thing they've got in Scotland is the community right to buy. And that is something that's making a real difference in some rural communities. And it leads to people being able to buy land. And then we've also got separate policies towards supporting community land trusts, which then can build and sort of run as essentially community trusts of properly affordable homes for people in the area. There's a one, I don't want to go on too long because this is one of my favourite subjects, but there's a wonderful documentary about the island of Eigg in Scotland. And Scotland, they have these rights, and this is partly because of Green politicians up in Scotland pushing through new laws. And these rights in England would make such a difference. And watch the documentary about Eigg, because there they've got exactly the problem of young people moving away, of community assets sort of withering away, and recognising that big developers will never do what we need, no matter how we try and control them, and giving the rights and the ability back to the communities to develop in these areas is the most important thing we can do. And it's genuinely inspiring when it starts to work, how happy the people are and how in control of their communities they
Sian, we
feel.
can see your passion is infectious on this. You can tell it's a subject very close to heart. No, it's a great thing. Luke.
Thank you. Will, thank you very much for your question from the Exmoor Young Farmers. As a West Country MP myself, not as west as you, but up in South Gloucestershire, I know exactly the sort of challenges you're talking about, and actually in a similar way that Tom was talking about, one of the things that we are very keen to do is to make it easier for rural communities to change those old agricultural buildings into housing and affordable housing, social housing. But we're also about devolving power away from Whitehall, away from London, to make sure local councils can set the priorities that they want to determine the type of housing that they want to in areas like yours, which is quite a specific challenge that you'll face in Exmoor compared to what we'll face in South Gloucestershire or other rural areas around the country. So there's absolutely more that we can do. I think that change of agricultural buildings is really important, making sure your local community has the power to build the sort of houses that they want. One of the other important commitments in our manifesto, which probably isn't directly relevant in Exmoor, but is that we are going to be continuing to protect the green belt. We feel passionately about the fact that the green belt should be protected and enhanced where we can, and prioritise brownfield sites for development, because we believe it serves a very specific purpose of keeping communities separate, stopping them merging into each other, keeping their individual identities, just like you all have a very specific identity in Exmoor. So we absolutely want to make sure that your local community has the power to determine the type of housing that will work for you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you, Will, for coming today and answering, giving that question. Please, round of applause for Will. Okay, and from Exmoor, we're now going to go to the north east, and I know it's really, really important to press our politicians not just on what's happening in London, but we know we have a big problem about the rest of London and the southeast. So we now have a question from Angela, who is the National Housing Federation Great Places Commissioner and Chief Executive of North Star Housing Association in Teesside. Angela.
Hello, thank you. So a view from the north. I've worked in social housing for around 30 years, and every day in the area that I work, I meet communities that feel left behind. I don't know if you've read the recent edition of Inside Housing this week, but there's a part of Middlesbrough called Gresham that is featured, and I would encourage you to have a read of that. Like many communities, not just in the north, but I'm giving you a northern view, like many communities in the North and Midlands, this community endures high levels of unemployment and child poverty, has suffered massively from local cuts, has significant empty homes, and despite best efforts of many people, these people live in rundown areas. Many people living there simply have no hope. How would your government bring opportunity back and help transform these communities into the great places that they used to be?
Thank you for that, John.
I know the areas that Angela is talking about, not least because in 2010, when Labour lost power, we had in place something called the Housing Market Renewal Programme, and we left for Tom and Luke's predecessors, the Conservatives and the Lib Dems, £311 million in the budget in 2010-2011. For the continuation of those, that was regeneration funding that recognised that you can lift communities by regenerating and fresh housing at the heart of that community regeneration. That was axed entirely after that. And on the broader front, this pains me really, because instead of simply seeing housing as a number of units or a programme to be delivered, we lose sight of the fact that housing is the heart of all our lives, it's the heart of our communities, it helps people put down roots, and we've lost over the last 10 years that sense of regeneration, economic, social and community regeneration. And we have to put housing, I say this to all colleagues on the platform here, together we have to rehabilitate the term regeneration. We have to see housing as a crucial linchpin of that, and it does require investment, which we'd put back in, but it requires something else, because it's become a byword, regeneration, for big developers moving in, changing the nature of an area, often forcing people out without the chance to come back. So we've also said where we have regeneration schemes, they can only go ahead when there's the consent of the people affected. There ought to be as well a guarantee for the people in those areas that if the areas of the estates are overhauled, they have a right to come back to a new home in the area on similar terms. And I think if we base our regeneration programme, A, on housing, B, on consent, and C, with a view to the community, not just the construction, then I think we start to put back something we've lost that's very valuable in the recent decade.
Thank you, John. Sian.
It's to say thank you to Labour for mending their ways in relation to regeneration, because I think we have seen far too many Labour councils take a demolition-based approach and a top-down approach to people's homes and estates and changing local areas, and it hasn't been good, because one of the things people want in terms of their housing, as well as like good conditions and affordability, is security and control, and the ability to control their homes and their local areas. And I think that's where green values and the way we approach things is different, although I acknowledge Labour have improved somewhat in recent months and years. I have persuaded the Mayor of London to put in ballot conditions for regeneration. But it's about funding people to do it bottom up, and our Green New Deal, as the Greens, involves a lot of funding going into local areas for people to decide how to do this themselves, as well as rights to buy up empty homes and redevelop homes. It's also the ability to set up community energy companies to create jobs, to do that retrofitting of people's homes in ways that's organised on a local level. And I think all of those things, giving people more power and more control over their communities, as well as funding to actually do things, is what's going to rejuvenate all these forgotten communities. Because let's not forget, that's one of the things that led to Brexit, was people feeling that they were having things done to them, that they were being ignored. And I think bringing the spirit back to places like the North East isn't just about an industrial revolution and new industries and things. It's also about giving people more power and control back in terms of their local areas and how they get run.
Okay, Tom, I'm going to come to you next, but I just want to, one thing that has come up a bit on social media is, of course, the austerity since 2010 saw a lot of cuts to local authorities, which of course impacted on sort of housing and the community and regeneration as well. But Tom, your thoughts on this?
Thank you for that introduction, Aisha.
So it was like you and Luke, don't worry.
Now, I've been critical of John for allowing homelessness to peak in 2003 under Labour. I'm now going to praise him, because the best example I have got of community regeneration through housing development came under the single regeneration budget under the Labour government, which I am very pleased that my local authority benefited from. It enabled us to take, and I think this underlines that this does require investment. Housing is infrastructure. We have to be willing to will the means to make it happen, and that certainly happened. This enabled an estate which any of you who watched the bill, any time on the bill there was a need for a 1960s estate with streets in the sky and tower blocks, that was the estate that I'm talking about. And I think it was just over £100 million that was provided, where the community were fully involved, and that was a community that decided it wanted to stay together. They didn't want to be split apart. They decided they wanted to stay together. The whole project was designed around that. There was also an agreement that because the local authority wanted to maintain, in fact slightly increase the number of properties on the site, that some metropolitan open land was used as part of that development. But it came with the facilities that you'd expect to have if you want to keep a community together. So that included the Phoenix Centre, which is a joint sports facility, library, schools on site and so on. And that was a very good example of an estate which had some significant challenges, particularly around antisocial behaviour and crime. As a result of that, substantial investment was completely turned around and is now an estate where there are very few issues, if any issues at all. So praise for John and a past Labour
It's
government.
nice to hear a bit of, it's a rare thing. I think that deserves a round of applause, actually. I know we're not doing rounds of applause, but it's quite rare to hear a politician say, actually, you guys did something good. So I think that's good, mature, grown-up politics. Luke.
Thank you, and thank you, Angela. Look, I've talked a little bit already about our ambition to devolve more and more power from Whitehall to the regions. That's a key part of what we want to try and achieve in the years ahead. So we'll continue to let local authorities, take more power over their communities. And also a key part of this, I think, is as Tom said, is about infrastructure and investment in the infrastructure when we're unlocking housing, to make sure that communities aren't feeling like we're just building more and more houses without the relevant infrastructure to support their communities. That's why we've have this £5.5 billion housing infrastructure fund that we are continuing, but also we have the Towns Fund, which is investing in a number of communities around the country to allow them to spend the money to see in the way that they see fit that best regenerates their local community. So we will continue to devolve power to communities to let them spend local money and have as much authority as possible over their own regeneration.
Okay, thank you very much. I think regeneration is such an important issue with housing, but the other thing which I think is really important to knit into it all is to making a place an attractive place to live. The cultural offer is very, very important, and investing in the services like schools and stuff, but also in kind of arts, sports facilities. All of that is very, very important as well. Right, we now come to our seventh and pretty much our final question, which is going to be asked by Dee Haas, who is the chairperson of the CPRE Hampshire branch and is a chartered landscape architect. And this is a very important question about sustainability. Dee.
Thank you. I think in the light of a recent discovery that we have a climate emergency on our hands, and I think that many people are in fuel poverty in this country, living in poorly insulated homes that were badly built, possibly between the wars, and haven't been updated. Energy use in the UK's 25 million homes is responsible for around 14% of national carbon emissions. 80% of the homes that we will be occupying in 2050 already exist. The next government will need to take meaningful action early in the Parliament to set us on the path to net zero emissions from housing. For new housing, this means stringent standards on energy efficiency, such as Passive House. Public procurement for the new social homes we've heard about tonight could set the standard for this, as seen by the Sterling Prize winner, Goldsmith Street development in Norwich. What steps will your party take to develop, implement and fully fund a strategy to retrofit homes and increase energy efficiency all across the board?
Right, Sian, I feel this question is made for you, so coming to you first.
Thank you, yes. I mean, obviously, if people are now catching up with the idea that we have a climate emergency and catching up with the big gaps that we've left, and homes and the existing homes, like you say, retrofitting the existing homes has been something that no government's really pursued. It's not a big sexy project you can point at and go, look, here in the sky is the thing I built. It's getting right in there and looking in detail at homes and where the leaks are and where the roof isn't right, and getting in there and sorting out the heating systems. It's a big project. I called it the project of the century the other day, and I think it really is. And the right amount of money needs to go in, and the right amount of effort and different aspects of it need to be done. It's a very detailed and an expert thing that needs to be done in each of the homes. I don't want to go on too long because I keep doing that. John said earlier on, like, only a Labour government will deliver this stuff. And I think the real answer is, only Greens in Parliament can make sure whoever's in government does this right. Certainly the development you cited in Norwich there was built by a Labour council under the influence of Green councillors. And I think that is possibly the ideal combination for getting this done.
Excellent. John, you can come back on that.
Built by a Labour council.
I said that. I literally just said that.
And that Sterling Prize at Goldsmith Street is a REBA prize, so it's very appropriate you mention it. You mention it, Dee. What it also tells us is actually our public housing can be people's best choice, not their last resort, if we do this big programme well. On climate change, we simply can't deal with the climate emergency unless we do a great deal more with our housing. And the government's independent watchdog, the Climate Change Committee, says that our housing standards and policy at the moment are failing to match up with that. So, number one, we could, because I did the agreement with the industry, they didn't like it in 2009, a programme to 2016 where all of our homes could have been built to zero carbon standards if that hadn't been swept away before it was due to be implemented. So we've got 1/3 homes in this country that could have been built to zero standard since then that haven't been. So number one, we'd introduce a zero carbon standard for all new homes. We'd do that within 3 years as a Labour government. Secondly, we've got to deal with the existing homes that we've got at the moment, as you quite rightly say, they're the majority, and they've been with us for decades. So a major retrofit programme with things like heat pumps, better insulation, better windows, doors, part of a decent homes, but a very big overhaul. Grant funding for the poorest, loan funding at zero interest for those that can afford to pay for some of those. And in that way, we can deal with the housing crisis and the climate crisis together.
Tom?
Well, I'm pleased to say that in Liberal Democrat London Borough of Sutton, we have what I believe are, and I mentioned it earlier, the first passive house secondary school and the first passive house primary school. So it's perfectly possible to build these things now. I went, as I said earlier, I went on a visit to see the secondary school. And what's interesting is that, for instance, it's not yet functioning exactly as it should because they haven't got all the pupils in the school yet because they're doing year 7 and year 8 and then starting to move them up the age group. And there aren't yet enough pupils in the school to make the school warm enough, because the heat from the children is actually a factor in making the school function in the way that it should as a passive house school. So there are some interesting lessons, I think, that are going to be learnt from that sort of project, which I hope will be applicable to the housing sector, perhaps more generally as well.
Just thinking maybe menopausal women like me could basically become a new source of like renewable energy, you know what I mean?
Aisha, you might be able to power it yourself, perhaps. But anyway, that you can do things already, but clearly we have to scale this up dramatically. And as a party, we're committed to an insulation programme that would deal with everyone in fuel poverty by 2025, every home by 2030. But I think we need to be a bit careful in terms of there have been some large rollout of insulation programmes in the past where actually it has been highly counterproductive in terms of the materials that have been used and their effectiveness. And we need to look perhaps more extensively at the use of more natural materials in terms of corks and things of that nature if we're going to do these things properly. And again, a little bit of political agreement. I agree with John that one of the things that was knocked out, I'm afraid, by the Conservatives when they came into power by themselves was the commitment to building new homes zero carbon. It was something the Coalition was committed to, but was deleted by the Conservatives.
Okay. Look, well, hang on. I'm just going to come back. I'm going to let Luke respond to that, Sean, and then I'll come back. We're kind of nearing towards the end, but Luke, I'll let you in, and Sean, I'll let you back.
Absolutely. Look, John's pretty right that the Climate Change Committee has made it very clear that we need to take action on housing and reducing carbon emissions from housing. Thank you, Dee. In our manifesto, we'll be introducing a future homes standard to make sure that all homes are have world-leading energy efficiency standards with low-carbon heating systems. We're also going to be consulting on measures to reduce carbon emissions by a third next year if we form a majority government. But also, like Tom, we also have some fantastic local climate change strategies drawn up by local authorities around the country who are making sure that they are holding house builders to account when they're looking at planning applications at the type of contribution that carbon emissions would be making to those applications when they're coming forward. So we're absolutely supporting local authorities to do that as well. But it's absolutely right, the Climate Change Committee have made the point that we should take action, and we will absolutely be doing that.
Okay, Sean, you wanted to come in just very quickly.
Because obviously I've said before that Labour's plans are about 1/3 of ours in terms of investment in new homes. And Tom said, like, we should do something. Tom, how much money are the Lib Dems going to put into retrofitting homes to high carbon standards? Because I don't know if anyone remembers the chart of investment plans. The Lib Dems are hardly putting in any capital investment as part of your
we're not in government at the moment.
We
have made a commitment to, as I just said, to insulate all homes that are in fuel poverty by 2025 and every home by 2030 as a result of the investment programme for dealing with climate change of £100 billion.
But that's £10 billion a year. We're putting in £100 billion a year. Labour are putting in, I think, £40 billion a year. So how are you going to do that with that money?
Well, where are you going to get your £100 billion a year from?
We're going to borrow it to invest in the future, and warm, dry homes pay back in no time in terms of health.
Sean, do you know what the Tory spent commitment is?
I don't think it's anything. I'm not sure.
Oh, right, okay. Just to get a bit of balance. Okay.
To be fair, I don't know.
Okay. Luke, do you want to come back? Is there an amount of money there? Don't want you to be.
Well, only that we're going to be introducing the future home standards that hasn't, as of yet, got a cost attached to it, and the measures to reduce emissions by it.
Okay. Right. We're just about come to the end, but there is one question I'm going to come back to because it's the chair's prerogative and it has come up on social media. And I'm going to go round the table very quickly. And this is it. Affordable housing is the critical issue here, and the definition of affordability is central. Incomes change according to different parts of the country. So the question to each panellist, I'm going to start with you, Luke. How much of your income do you think is reasonable and right to spend on housing?
I think probably about 50% of income. But look, I think if social housing...
Okay, let's let everyone... Hang on, let everybody go through. Hang on, it's not question time. Come on, everybody. We can do better than that. So 50%, Luke, Sian?
The absolute maximum should be 1/3.
Okay.
Of your take-home pay.
1/3 take-home pay. Tom?
I was going to say 30%, which is same as Sean.
Okay, and John?
Look, the term affordable has been so misused by ministers, it's mistrusted, and that's a problem for us all.
Okay,
Look,
but what as a percentage?
A yardstick for everyone is about 1/3 of income.
Okay.
Is a good yardstick for affordability, and that's at the heart of our definition. But you can't link it to the market. You've got to link it to people's incomes, which is what we do, linked to around 1/3 of local income. So it'd be different in different areas.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody, for answering that question. And thank you to all the questions that came in today. I think we had a really, really good kind of gallop through sort of lots of big issues. But we are now going to go to closing statements. Each candidate is just going to have a couple of minutes to wrap up. So do please hear them out. And Tom, I'm going to start with you. Just going to go down the table.
Okay, well, I perhaps finish where I started, which is that all of the political parties are making some either concrete offers or some sometimes fantastical offers. I hope people will look at what the independent assessments of the different party proposals have been in terms of what is realistic and what is not. I believe that the proposals that the Liberal Democrats have put forward for this general election are deliverable. The IFS agrees with us, and what that would deliver is 300,000 homes a year, of which 100,000 would be affordable, and homes with a particular focus on sustainability. I think we have a track record in local government that demonstrates that we are capable of doing that. And we also have a package in terms of welfare reforms, which the Resolution Foundation have described as progressive, and the amount of investment we're putting into dealing with some of the benefits challenges. I think £6 billion would make a very substantial difference to people. Certainly, dealing with the long delay in securing universal credit, dealing with some of the problems around dual earners, dealing with some of the problems around people in self-employment. So I think we have a credible offer which would be deliverable in government.
Okay, thank you very much. Sian.
So I think in this election, we've got a current Prime Minister who's running for another term, who we know as Londoners, as London Assembly members, has the most abysmal record on housing as Mayor of London that there could possibly be. So I think it's really important that we do try to make sure we do not have a Conservative government if we really care about housing. I don't think it's had the right amount of attention in this election so far. I've been in some of the big debates on the television. I've watched the Question Time. It very rarely comes up. And I think any of you who work in housing, you can get any influence on these debates, on the questions that get asked. Please make sure there's a housing question, because I think it really does differentiate between the parties. I think we've made some progress on the progressive side of politics in opening the door to more radical policies, particularly I think from Labour in recent years. I've worked really hard on the Mayor of London to improve his policies, and now he talks about rent controls at long last. He is giving ballots to residents, and he has had an influence on the National Labour Party as well, who are committed to these things as well. We've got amazing campaign groups out there on renters' rights who are opening the door to new changes in the law that even the government has accepted. So I think the door is open to big radical changes in housing policy. I think it's been very hard fought by a lot of the groups who are represented here and a lot of individuals out there who are organising. And I think we shouldn't let it drop after the election goes away, and we should carry on our work afterwards, no matter who is the government. But I'm hopeful that we can get a change of government in this election.
Okay, thank you very much. Luke.
Well, in this election, we want to make absolutely clear that we want to build more homes in the Parliament ahead of us. We have built 1.5 million homes in the last 9 years, and part of that under the coalition. We want to build 1 million homes in the next Parliament, and through that £9 billion affordable home programme, we will deliver hundreds of thousands of new affordable homes, including homes for social rent. And I really appreciate the questions today on homelessness. There is a huge amount of work to do to make sure that we expand our off-sleeping initiative, to make sure that we expand our successful pilots that we are already underway, like Housing First, and making sure that we are doing more to make sure offenders have a safe place to stay the day that they come out of prison. Looking at the offender accommodation pilots that we're already trialling in places like Leeds, we are making this commitment to end rough sleeping altogether by 2024. We're very proud to have brought that forward 3 years. That is backed up with an expansion in policy, like the expansion of the pilots that are laid down in our manifesto. But before we can do and deliver all of this change and improvement, we have to face up to the fact that in front of us we have a roadblock in Parliament with an issue that we need to get past. It's been mentioned just now. We need to settle this issue on the European Union. The Conservatives will be able to leave the European Union in January, so we can focus on these issues that are so much more important to so many people in our country, like increasing the stock of housing, like giving people the opportunity to buy their own home, like through the right to buy, which we are proud that 98,000 people have been able to buy their council homes, like the Help to Buy, where 1.4 million people are using that ISA to save, and 220,000 people have been buying homes through that programme. So the Conservatives will continue to deliver a radical housing programme into the next Parliament, and we will achieve that in the years ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Luke. John.
Thank you for coming. Thank you to Shelter and the other organisations. It's great to debate housing in the warm here rather than being on the cold doorstep, so it's a break for us all. Thank you. My starting point is this. Everyone knows someone who's been hit by the housing crisis we have in this country. Everyone says it's getting worse, not better, over the last 10 years, and they're right, as the government has slashed funding for new low-cost homes, refused to regulate for higher standards, and given a freer hand to big developers to build what they want, where they want. And we simply can't face another 5 years of what we've had for the last 10. We need a radical programme now which overcomes the failings of the last 10 years and, yes, some of the shortcomings of the last 50 years. So you've got a Labour manifesto setting out a plan to fix the country's housing crisis. We'll invest so that by year 5 we will be building in this country 150,000 new council and housing association homes each year and keep that up. That is the highest number that we've had in this country since the 1960s and the biggest ramp up, especially in council housing, that we've seen since the years after the Second World War. We'll legislate to give private renters the rights as consumers we're used to in other markets. So rent controls, minimum standards, open-ended tenancies. We'll help young home buyers take that first step into the market with discount homes linked to average local incomes, first dibs for local residents on homes that are built, and also a new levy on overseas buyers of property in this country. And finally, we will end rough sleeping homelessness within a parliament, and we set a plan to do that. In the end, this is a big choice on housing at this election. It's a choice between a continuing Conservative government that will continue to step back in the face of a failing housing market, or a Labour government that will step up with a plan to fix the country's housing crisis and to change Britain for the better. Thank you.
Excellent. Please give a warm round of applause to all our guests tonight. I really just want to, thank all of you for coming here tonight, and I know people have travelled from all parts of these shores to be here and take part in this really, really important debate. And thank you also to all the organisations who put this on. This is such an important issue, and as somebody who works a lot in the media, I'm doing a lot of political commentating around this election. It's really frustrating that this issue, which is so germane to our kind of healthy communities and societies, is not getting more of an airing. And I was actually quite you know, I was quite heartened to hear, you know, it wasn't just a knockabout. There was some common ground. There was a lot of areas where people could, you know, kind of acknowledge where the other had done good. And, you know, whatever happens at this general election, whoever wins, whoever loses, whether it's a hung parliament, whether it's a majority, I do hope that on this very, very important issue, there can be the spirit of cross-party working, because you can't fix this issue alone. And it is a great stain on our country that, you know, in this day and age, you know, we're about to go into our new decade, and the idea of somebody and every family having a safe, affordable, decent home, you know, is in contention. That is a human right. That should not be something which is in contention. So I think we all have to work really hard to make sure that this stays as an important agenda after the general election. I know we're all going to be very, very obsessed with Brexit, but each one of you in this room, please keep the pressure on your local representative, all the key players in Parliament, the ministers, the select committees, your local government people. There's a lot of people that care about this issue. But please have a big round of applause, and thank you so much for coming. You've been an absolutely brilliant audience. Have a good evening.